Hello, everybody. My name is George Kors, and today we're talking about Henny Jahn's Perrudja. I have mentioned this as of yet untranslated into the English novel on the channel before, and I am excited to get in here. There's a ton of stuff going on in this very wild modernist work. Um, yeah, what is there to say about Perrudja? I mean, what a really interesting novel, and overall, for a novel from the 1920s, um, I would say a really, really unique specimen of modernist writing. Before we dive deep into that, if you like the channel, you know about me. You know about me as a writer and thinker. My new novel, Singleizers, came out in June of 2025. Depending upon when you're watching this, it would be super nice for you to support the channel and buy that novel. I don't know, leave a review somewhere or post about it, whatever. That makes a difference. That is all I ask. That is a very nice way to support this channel and for me to continue making these videos to support the literary arts across the world. I hope that I'm supporting them. I don't know if I am or not. Who knows? It's the internet. It's a weird place. But thank you, single artists out there in the world. Link down below. And let's get back to Henny Jahnn. Now, I suspect for many folks out there, you probably have not heard of Henny Jahnn. That's okay. Henny Jahnn was a modernist German writer, playwright, musician, organ builder, avowed staunch pacifist, who really acted on his pacifist philosophy. Open bisexual. Everybody in the channel knows my affinity for Thomas Mann, another bisexual German writer. As a bi man myself, I love to see some of those, 20th century bi writers out there. And Henny Jahnn was a really unique person, but Perrudja and much of his writing is not translated into the English. And, I hear occasionally from various folks, oh, George, there will be a translation of Perrudja or the wooden ships or, any variety of material that Henny Jahnn was responsible for. And my typical belief there is, I'll believe it when I see it. As a modernist, Henny Jahnn doesn't necessarily, in my opinion, fit neatly into some of the more popular modernist niches that we see when folks talk a lot about somebody like James Joyce or Virginia Woolf or Franz Kafka, for example, for a German language modernist that we might think of. And for that reason, a novel like Perrudja, do I think that it's going to be translated into English? I don't know. And my honest suspicion would be that after about 100 years of not being fully translated in English, that might continue. I think a lot about translation, think a lot about the task of it. If it would be an interesting project to undertake for a lot of reasons. And let's talk a little bit about the novel, and maybe that'll be a little clearer. And I guess before we even talk about the novel, let's talk about Henny Jahnn first. As I mentioned, Henny Jahnn was an avowed pacifist. And in the First World War, he left Germany for Norway to avoid enlistment. It was so adamant, went a self-imposed exile, which was repeated again in the Nazi Zeit when fascism came to the German Republic and took over. He once again fled, and I think that is really, I think for us to think of some of the relation of modernism and modernist writers to war. If we think about somebody like Hemingway, or if we think about somebody like Joyce and their experiences in post-war Paris, and the experiences that they try to relate at times for veterans of the First World War. Same thing with Virginia Woolf, obviously, in the very famous Mrs. Dalloway. This relation to war is a major consideration for a lot of modernist writers as this large, modern contemporary machine, this large aspect of society. And Henny Jahnn is coming at that from such a different angle, as a really avowed and practiced pacifist in a way that I think you see few people committing to pacifism in the way that he did. Um, that alone, makes him just sort of an interesting character in the arts to think about, in the literary arts. Um, and, there's all these little aspects of his life that are also really provocative. One that you'll see in Perrudja, should you pick this up, that's really interesting. Hans Henny Jahnn was an organ builder and a very talented musician. And there's music in here. I'll show a passage later. Just it shows maybe that real attachment to music that Henny Jahnn had in a different way from other writers. I think we think of somebody like Thomas Pynchon, for example, who has a lot of silly lyrics in a novel like Gravity's Rainbow, these really silly songs and sort of spoofy kind of things we see throughout all, V and Gravity's Rainbow and Crying of Lot 49, and the list goes on. And that is a very different sort of attachment that Hans Henny Jahnn has. And then also, Hans Henny Jahnn was an open bisexual, and I think that, in that time, especially amongst the, northern Germans, Hans Henny Jahnn from near Hamburg, and in certain northern German communities there were very progressive, open communities of gay and bi and trans people, particularly around Berlin at the time. And Henny Jahnn is an example of somebody who, unlike Thomas Mann, is really avowed, like in the sense of in touch with his own self and being less closeted in a different way. And that I think is really important for anybody who's reading pretty much any of Hans Henny Jann's work, but particularly Perrudja, because the sort of sexuality throughout the novel is really potent, and that's something for us to consider, more concretely. So after sort of that little brief bit about Hans Henny Jahn and just sort of the history there, and these exiles are important, and his sexuality is important. All of this is, this really complex character. Looking at the novel Perrudja, Perrudja centers on a titular man, Perrudja, who navigates the novel, who navigates much of the novel, and it is modernism. It is certainly modernist writing. There is a little bit of a twist in perspective that I would say with Perrudja that I would not necessarily say that I've seen a lot in other works. And I'm going to reference Ulysses here. I don't have it to recommend or anything. But Ulysses by James Joyce is often the sort of prototypical modernist text that I see folks pointing to. I see a lot of folks on socials talking about it. See a lot of folks on YouTube, so on and so forth. So, with that assumption in mind, we'll go forth. I have seen occasionally some folks comparing Perrudja to Ulysses. I think that's a rather erroneous comparison. I do not believe that it is necessarily. Um, I don't think that there is a lot of overlap in my readings of the two. It it is clear that Hans Henny Jahn was influenced by Ulysses, as many modernists in the 1920s were. But I wouldn't say a reading of this is going to be like Ulysses or anything along those lines. And a big reason for that is in Ulysses we see the ancient recast as modern. So this retelling, right, of the Odyssey, we see Ulysses, these themes throughout. The different episodes, of the ancient, then not translated, maybe transcribed, reworked, rethought into a new and modern contemporary way in Joyce's novel. In Perrudja, I feel almost like I'm seeing the opposite. That as opposed to this ancient thing that is recast as new, that is recast as this, separate new experience of society and civilization and language, instead, I'm seeing the modernity as deeply ancient. And especially for the first half of this novel, for the majority of that first half, which is primarily set basically up in Norway, in Scandinavia here, where Perrudja is, between the mountains and different villages, you really have this feeling that modernity's roots go so far back that modernity is actually not new. Modernity is this old, almost primal thing. So where there's a lot of, you know, how should we say this? Maybe there's a lot of cosmopolitanism in Ulysses. That this rethinking of an ancient Greek text is in a city, and it's very, it's taking the trolley around and visiting different restaurants and experiencing tabooed sexuality in all these new and psychological ways. We see in Perrudja, I think, the exact opposite, which is that modernity is this primal old thing that can't separate itself whatsoever from its ancient, unknown past. And that, I think, is why I would say, when it comes to works of modernist literature, for me, Perrudja sort of stands separately from a lot of other works, because not only am I seeing, this the tried and true modernist commentary on modernity, of course, that's redundant, but and its relationship to the ancient, but it's flipped in this really interesting way. One of the things about Perrudja that I find really provocative is, instead of focusing on Greek, and ancient Greek myth and these sort of much more Eurocentric mythologies and this more Eurocentric feeling of the ancient, a lot of the earlier sections in Perrudja focus on Persian mythology. I found that really interesting, and I found that to be actually a very tidy twist as well. That kind of showcases a little bit of Henny Jahn's larger thinking of the sort of global culture, this global literary culture that we inhabit, that I thought was really, really cool. Um, and, so if you're out there and you're looking for, if you're interested in finding Perrudja, and you're going to crack it open and read it, and you're reading folks saying, hey, this is a lot like Ulysses, I don't know that I agree with that. I think that outside of them both being clearly modernist texts, that sort of comment on the nature of the ancient and the modern, I don't know that I'm seeing a lot of overlap there. And also, with the language and some of the sort of experimentation that happens in here, it just feels a little bit different, and it doesn't quite have the same sort of character that I think Ulysses might have. Hopefully, you weren't out there saying, "Oh, I'm so excited to read this German Ulysses." It's not that. Let's talk a little bit about themes, and maybe that'll sort of clarify some of the stuff that's going on here in Perrudja. First and foremost, one of the major themes that is just throughout almost every page of this novel is death. Death, it comes forth in so many different instances within the text, in so many different ways. There are deeply grotesque and upsetting scenes, that occur in the novel. Just graphic images of violence, of blood, murder, and the list goes on. And that's not to say that Perrudja is the very violent novel. It's not, it's not like you're going to be reading this and having an experience like, reading Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian or whatever. But this is one of those themes. Death is one of those themes that, for me, signals this perception of modernity as this primal, almost counterintuitively not new thing. And the presence and the actions of violence, and especially the sort of surrounding death, to me really gave me this feeling of this ancient old history that we have yet to escape from. And modernity is just this idea of the desire of the escape from that history, rather than the realization of the escape from that history. So that, first and foremost, death, huge theme throughout the novel. and the character Perrudja and the way the character Perrudja interacts with death at various times and interacts with various, people who are dying in various capacities, is really really interesting. To that end, continuing on there, from a, sort of different themes perspective, is this sort of uncanny, almost saccharine sentimentality at times, but emotion, um, really raw and unfiltered emotion is present throughout this text. Um, Time and time again, we see characters crying, sobbing, weeping. We see characters, experiencing these really intense emotions. And this heightened emotional sensibility to me is another sort of area where in maybe a more anglophone modernist novel, I might see a little bit of that raw emotion more psychologically, more internally, that's kind of flipped, and the perception of that overt emotion, that overt crying, as opposed to the internal agony, that to me again sort of brings us back to this more unfiltered, primeval human history of just rawness, raw emotion, raw feeling. Um, Sort of interrelated, perhaps, with that thread of emotion that happens throughout the novel, I would say, is tabooed sex and tabooed sexuality. I did not, I wasn't sure exactly what to expect in reading Perrudja with Henny Jahnn and knowing about his sexuality and his experience of sexuality. Um, I will say it was, there's so many of those complex feelings of what taboo is and what sexuality is and what, is acceptable versus unacceptable. Um, Almost, I'm seeing roots here almost of some of Nabokov's 1960s sort of comments on taboo, but Nabokov was so heavy-handed, and with Perrudja, there's such a mixture of the grotesque in all of these scenes, that to me, I was really actually kind of impressed with everything that was going on here, because there is some remarkable subtlety, to experience of sexuality and to experiences of gender here. I There were moments in the novel when I was wondering about gender perceptions and how Henny Jahnn was thinking about his own gender and what that meant and what that looked like. And obviously there's cultural clashes here between myself as a US American person in the 21st century and Henny Jahnn, as a 20th century Northern German, writing and living in Norway. There's all these different sort of clashes in what we perceive in terms of gender and how gender interacts with our sexuality and our society and our actions and so on and so forth, and how we interact with gender. So there might be a little bit of fuzziness for me there. That's something that I would want to explore a little bit more. And I do, Henny Jahn's history and how he relates to his mother personally in his own life, and his sister dying, and his, taking her name because she's dead and her mother loved her more than Henny Jahnn. There's so much complex gender expression there that I think really, if there was one reason for me to advocate for the translation of this novel, would be that. And I I I think it merits a deeper read. Certainly, it merits another deeper read than I was giving it. Um, some more sort of, let's say, elemental themes that arise throughout the text, are music. Music is quite present throughout the text, and I don't it the pagination on all these editions is going to be very different. So just a warning on that, but I believe my page is 552. Um, but there are sections of sheet music, throughout the novel. Not terribly many, but there's a few of them. These sections that come up, that I thought were rather provocative and interesting. Um, the other that I would say is color. Color and precious stones, amethysts, um, these really sort of foundational symbols occur and recur throughout the text at various times, and really are maybe if you're reading Perrudja and you're looking for something that's very very easy to sort of latch onto as a possible place to dig in and get into some symbolism. I think color and precious stones would be one of those places that I might recommend. Overall, maybe it sounds like, okay, well, what's the plot of this thing? And the plot is, sort of loosely Perugia and falling in love and having some, relations with a person and some drama there, and then also some material success that comes later. Um, One of the really interesting things about the novel that I like, and that might make it easier for folks who are maybe less inclined to dip their toes into the German if they have some German and they're not quite ready, is I really appreciated how at the beginning all of the chapter titles are listed. And I'm familiar of some other novels that do something similar to this, but this is a really great way. It actually was really helpful in terms of the structure, reminding me of everything that had happened, and also to some of those sort of cultural references, like I was saying, the Persian mythology and so forth. Having the listed chapter titles was really a way that I was able to remind myself of what Henny Jahnn had situated within the novel and what Hans Henny Jahnn was doing throughout the novel. Um, so I think that might be something to consider here. I would also say, I think going back to the beginning and my comments on is this going to be translated, and my general presumption is no, but my take there has a little bit to do with not it relating to us as contemporary readers, but more it relating to what contemporary audiences are interested in. And that my thinking there might be erroneous, and my apologies if you disagree with me, and I understand. I think this novel does relate really well to contemporary audiences. The gender expression and sexuality in this novel is something that I really need to dig into more deeply, because there is a ton to dig into here, especially when I think a little bit more about the nuances of the expression of self and the perception of self, and the multifaceted nature of the perception of self. All of these are threads that are just sort of begging to be pulled on here by Hans Henny Jahnn. Um, and I would also say, one other way that this novel relates to more contemporary audiences and might be a good reason to translate it would be the novel's commentary on war industries. The latter portion, I would say, like the last third, the last 200 or so, 250 or so pages of my edition, comment on the sort of war machine, to use sort of English anachronism, and war industries at pretty great detail. And Henny Jahnn even takes credit for sort of speculating into existence atomic weapons. There's these weapons called O-Waffen in the text, and even in my edition, um, Hans Henny Jahnn wrote this little introduction to my edition in which he comments on that, and talks about how interesting it was that he was able to reach that conclusion before this technology had even been invented. Um, that's something to think about here. And I would even say, I don't know if you have the Heinrich Heine Verlag edition, your pages will be the same. But if you look at page 508 of my edition, there's even a really provocative sentence that I think even folks on the internet, on socials might find really really interesting here. I gotta find it here. Ja, Frucht einer Entwicklung, die man Spätkapitalismus nennen könnte. Now, Spätkapitalismus, late capitalism. I'm not really sure what the etymology of late capitalism is as a concept. And if you know, I would love for you to comment and to share that with us. If you actually really know, please no speculation. Um, but looking at a novel from 1929 and looking at it using what is now, in a lot of Marxist circles on the internet, Marxist circles on the internet, something that people talk about, and even outside of those more sort of economy critical or capitalism critical circles on the internet, we hear this phrase "late capitalism" kind of a lot. And here's Henny Jahnn, 100 years ago, talking about Spätkapitalismus. Um, Definitely a lot to think through there, and just how how he's referencing a lot of these things in in relation to society, in relation to the feeling of the ancient and sexuality and the experience of emotion and the experience of sexuality. I think it's all really, really, really interesting. Um, to that end, I think in that last third where Perrudja kind of emerges from the mountains and this more pastoral experience into a more capitalist grounded experience, that space there, for me, that really kind of reminded not reminded, that's the incorrect verb here, but I would say that evoked for me something sort of akin to proto pension. And that sounds weird, but I got this feeling, and I don't know, rumor has it that pension read or reads in German. I have no way of knowing if pension the person has interacted in any way with Perrudja. Um, but some of those scenes, some of the names of corporations, some of the actions that they do, the way that there's commentary on the military industrial complex, the way that there's commentary on capitalism, a lot of that seemed like stuff that happens a lot later in a novel like Gravity's Rainbow. Um, and I don't know, if other readers are finding that in Perrudja, but I really, really got that sense in those last 200 pages. I couldn't shake it that maybe Thomas Pynchon, many, many years ago had put his German to use and read this novel, especially in those last 200 pages, because I really thought it was interesting. Um, I think everything's interesting. Um, Last thing I'll comment on the novel here, is Perrudja as a character. Perrudja, the man, is often grotesque. Is framed as almost being vacant of thought, and just experiencing, and just perceiving, and that's it. That changes throughout the novel. But Perrudja as a character is really, really interesting. If we think about other famous, modernist characters, Leopold Bloom, for example, from Ulysses, to sort of circle back on Ulysses, Leopold Bloom is full of thought. He's full of psychology. And look at the characters in Thomas Mann's Zauberberg, in Magic Mountain. Look at these modernist characters. They are full of thought. They are full of cognition, of thinking, of expression, of analysis, of a rich cultural interaction, regardless of their position in society, even if they don't necessarily um, possess or maintain a privileged position in that society, right? It's not like Leopold Bloom is some famous writer or a professor or a theologian or philosopher. And that, and the characters who are in the sanatorium in Magic Mountain, it's not as though they are famous writers or political thinkers, although a few of them are. Um, that is sort of really kind of standard. Perrudja, on the other hand, by contrast, is almost vacant of thought, especially initially in those first 100 to 150 pages. Perrudja, the character, Perrudja, the man, just seems to be a vessel experiencing. Um, and that experience is really, I keep saying this, rooted in this more primal, unknown history immemorial. That really, to me, is one of the most provocative parts of this work. Because some of the actions Perrudja takes, some of the things that he says or does, all of a sudden emerge from this almost primal feeling person. And that is a stark contrast for me to other modernist works, and it certainly is a contrast to me for many postmodernist works. Um, so at the end of the day, I I hope to advocate that folks take on more complex literature. And I think Perrudja is one of those novels that, even if it doesn't find a translation, um, I really do believe it merits some more serious consideration from those of us who are able to interact with it in the German. And across sort of its many chapters and all the sort of various expressions throughout the novel, I think it is really provocative and shows us uh, a different way to view our modernity, other than here's this new era. An era so new that we need to reimagine some of the most beloved ancient Greek texts as new for ourselves. Um, it feels much more related. Like we have not departed this previous era at all, and this industrialization and quote unquote modernization is all just uh superficial, and really doesn't separate us out from that mammalian primeval human from 50,000 years ago, who lived a very different life, but at the same time experienced those emotions, that sexuality, that violence, that death, all as real as we experience it. Very, very incredible novel for folks to engage with, and I hope that you, if you're seriously considering this, I hope you do pick it up. Let's talk about some recommendations. I just have three. I had a lot of trouble coming up with recommendations for Perrudja, and I'm giving three, as best as I can. Because I had a lot of trouble sort of theorizing what would be, some recommendations that I would have for the person who's watching this who has read Perrudja and is now looking for something else. Um, the first recommendation, I think, might be, you know just coming from that place of feeling confounded in literature, rather than sort of a shared structural or thematic quality. And that would be Samuel Beckett's three novels. Um, you know, Maybe some of you have read Waiting for Godot, but Malone Dies, and The Unnamable are really, really, it's an incredible three novels here. And Beckett obviously worked under Joyce, did research for Joyce. And if there is a person who's writing in the English that I think I would maybe cross compare Hans Henny Jahnn to, I think I would choose Beckett over Joyce. And one of the reasons, for that, particularly, is Beckett originally wrote these three in the French, and then um, translated them into the English later. And I think that is there's something to be spoken for the sort of alienation one feels with language, in here, and it was a very big intentionality of Mr. Beckett's there. So I think there's something to explore there between those two. Um, the next, I recommend Herman Melville's Moby Dick, and I think one of the reasons why I recommend Mr. Melville here, and I have a really took a lot of notes in this, but I have a wonderful illustrated edition that is just really has these great, like, wood cuttings. Um, One of the reasons why I would recommend Moby Dick here is because of its 19th century depiction of queer sexuality, and I think that if you're a humanities student out there, who's a millennial like me, and um, you were trained in the humanities, one of the things that might be trite to you is that there's a lot of queerness in Moby Dick. There is. It's still worthy of a reading, even if for my fellow highly trained folks in the humanities might see that as a little trite. Um, Definitely worth exploring. Last thing, and last recommendation here. I've recommended on the channel. I will continue to recommend on the channel that everybody be buffing up on their intersectional feminism. But Gloria Anzaldúa's La Frontera. Um, I was trying to think through, what would be some texts, some really, impactful philosophical texts that might, be that thing for somebody to start exploring experiences of sexuality and self. And I see, pardon me, I see a ton of commentary on this on socials. Um, I think that Gloria Anzaldúa and that notion of borderland and her status as mestiza and so this idea of being on the border between two countries, and in this case between like the United States and Mexico, and that liminal space, I think that that's a really complex task to explore, and in a novel like Perrudja, where we see so much of this in between space time and time again, and just this hybrid nature. I think that Anzaldúa would be a worthy companion read to Henny Jahnn, and especially in how Anzaldúa, much like Beckett here, renders language. Much of this is rendered in Spanish as well as in English. And one of the things that I've noticed, sort of engaging more widely with different languages and with my own languages, and trying to read across languages and really dig into, this process and understanding literature across languages. That to me has been really greatly complicated by how I see people perceiving language, and how I see people perceiving what is acceptable language versus what is unacceptable language. At the end of the day, there's so much rich complexity in discourse, and some of the sentences that Hans Henny Jahnn writes here are pretty unusually phrased for the German. So I think Anzaldúa, because of the sort of multi-language nature, I hesitate to say bilingual, but the multi-language nature of this, and the reason why I hesitate to say bilingual is because I don't want to reduce it to just two languages, but this rich expression of multiple languages and multiple cultures. I think we all could do to revisit Gloria Anzaldúa and check this out, especially if you're digging into Perrudja. I'm gonna put Anzaldúa right there. I hope that you consider digging into this text to Perrudja by Hans Henny Jahnn. I know that it's not translated into English, and perhaps we shall live to see the day. Again, I've heard so many rumors. I'll believe it when I see it. Let me know if you are. First off, are you interested in a novel that's like this? After everything, would you be interested in diving into this novel? And I hope that you are, and I hope that it's something that you consider. And if you're a German speaker, or if you've got a little German in you, I hope that you consider it. I know a lot of folks who are out there, reading German language novels, maybe aren't even familiar themselves with Hans Henny Jahnn. He's certainly not extremely popular by any standard. But nonetheless, as a figure, really, really provocative. I think really provocative. And there's a few little translations out there. I think one of his novels is translated, and maybe some snippets of Perrudja are translated out there. I hope that you're safe and okay. I just want to thank you for bearing with me today and talking through Perrudja, because this is a really cool novel, and I hope that you give it the time that it deserves. If you want to learn more about me as a writer, thinker, um, you can go to my website, georgecourse.com. You can visit my socials at gbk7288 if I'm using them. And again, you can buy Sing Lazarus out there. Sing Lazarus or False Memory Voices. I hope you do. And I want to thank you so much again for engaging in literature, and I hope that you do the brave step and start reading in other languages. And yeah, thank you again. I hope you're good. Please be safe, be nice, and have a great day. See you later, everybody. Bye bye.